is Let's Talk with Dani Stover.
Hey, hello. Welcome to the show. I'm so glad you're here. Come in for a hug. There we go. You ever reach into the bottom of a Cracker Jack box only to find the preserved stomach contents of a long extinct baby dinosaur? Ew, wait, that can't be right. This is actually really cool. There was a big discovery made in Alberta. Scientific American says it's the first time a Tyrannosaur's stomach contents have been found. And they were sort of found by accident. A technician was cleaning this 73 million year old fossil that they found in 2009 when they noticed something in the ribs. Dr. Gregory Erickson is a professor of anatomy and vertebrate paleobiology at Florida State University.
It's an amazing snapshot into not just the moment this animal died, but what it was doing in the weeks up to it. Whatever it died of, it was buried very quickly, and it's extremely well preserved to the point where the stomach contents are there. And that's just about the rarest of the rare. It's very rarely do we find a juvenile Tyrannosaur, and to find one with stomach contents, it's kind of like finding the crown jewels in the bottom of a Cracker Jack box. This is just unheard of.
So today I learned that a Tyrannosaurus rex is just one species of a tyrannosaur. Now, rex is Latin for king, which is fitting because these big baddies ruled the school, so to speak. But tyrannosaurs would be the genus, and there are different ones of differing sizes, and this one is believed to be a Gargosaurus libratus. Now, speaking of T-Rexes, they could be 40 feet, tip to tail, and they could weigh 7 to 9 tons. So to put that in perspective, that's about the weight of a 48-foot van trailer or a school bus full of students or 7 Liberty Bells. You'll hear more on this tonight. Now I want to talk about clothes because it's the season of abundance and you might be going to parties and feeling like you have nothing to wear. And it's tempting to buy yourself a new top. I get it. And this also just goes for things in general. This is not fun to think about, but pretty much everything you could ever want or possibly need, it's been made already. And I feel this is especially true when it comes to fast fashion. Now, I saw a video on Instagram the other day from the Clothes Horse podcast, and I was hooked, watched the whole thing. And it was about how new clothes kind of suck these days. Maybe the quality isn't there. You're paying more. You're getting less. And that's because of the high rate of turnover. Now, fast fashion is a term used to describe clothing that is made to move quickly and to keep up with the ever-changing trends that appear to be very cyclical, judging by the fact that Y2K fashion is in. But there is a pressure to stay on trend or even ahead of the trends. And these companies, of course, have bottom lines. They want to reduce their costs and speed up production. This often means quality takes a dive and corners may be cut when it comes to environmental concerns. They might use cheap, toxic dyes. And of course, there are extreme labor issues in this industry as well. And I'm not trying to shame you for buying clothing that is considered fast fashion. This whole thing is not your fault. You're just one person. And there are just shy of 8 billion people on the planet. So can you just remember that number for a sec? Great. Every single year, there are approximately 100 to 150 billion pieces of new clothing made. Up to 150 billion. Every year. That is a lot of tees, tanks, and tight trousers. It's estimated that 30% of that 150 billion are never sold. 30% of 150 billion is 45 billion tees, tanks, and tight trousers that never touch a bum. Like not in a creepy way, but like pants touch your bum. You see where I'm going here? These clothes aren't sold. They aren't worn. They aren't washed. They aren't even hung in a closet to be forgotten about. So what was that number I asked you to remember? Oh yeah. Just shy of 8 billion people on the planet. Meaning every single year, 5 garments per person are unsold. So they might be burned, they might be destroyed, they might be sent to landfill. And over time, this process means the price you pay goes up. It's safe to say that these businesses already know the stats I just shared with you, and so they got to cover their costs. That $80 sweater is probably only worth $35, but you're paying for all that unsold stuff. The time, the energy, the money that goes into essentially nothing. Well, it's not nothing. It's a lot of trash. So anyway, that's my spiel on fast fashion. And growing up, I loved fast fashion. I was always like, I have nothing to wear, as I tore apart my drawers and closet full of things to wear. And it feels good to shop. Of course it does. I love a browse. I love to try things on. I love touching a fabric. And I love thinking about how this jacket will change everything. Now, the idea of needing to be on trend or ahead of the trend or to have your finger so on the pulse of what folks are buying, they know what you want to buy before you even think about buying it. It kind of sounds like the toy industry in a way. And I would also wager that any toy you could ever want or possibly need has already been made. But then I feel like a killjoy because shopping for toys can be enjoyable. You're thinking about how excited your child will be when they get it. You have memories of opening brand new toys around the holidays or at your birthday. I mean, this Lego set, this will change everything. But I think there are some weird things going on with the toy biz specifically. Sales are declining. In fact, Mastermind, which was always a store that felt way too rich for my blood, announced last week that it had struck a deal to sell a majority of their stores. It still needs to be approved, but if it isn't, it's not looking good. This might mean they could keep open 43 of their stores, which would also help their employees. And according to court filings, Mastermind had total liabilities of $62.1 million. Now, in 2022, annual sales for the Canadian toy industry generated $2.39 billion in an increase of 1% since 2019. Now, this industry has faced record-breaking growth in the last few years, but it's falling down like a leaning tower of Jenga, and it's hurting brick and mortars and independence. And it's a pain that's like stepping on that brick of Lego. On the way, you may be blaming the economy for this, and that's fair. Surely we can. But also, buying habits have changed drastically. And this could be what's causing the trouble in Toyland. Stick around. I'm Dani Stover, and you're listening to Let's Talk.
This is content producer Glenn Dragonia with another installment of
Did You Hear?
This is where we talk about the bits of news that could be slipping past your radar. But if you're one of the people who haven't been giving blood because you're not sure if you're actually allowed to or not, well, tune into this because I got some news for you. Like, did you hear that after 20 years, Canada Blood Services and Health Canada have finally agreed to lift a ban that largely existed because of mad cow disease?
It sounds confusing, but good.
Let me explain. This ban was adopted by many countries and blood agencies around the world and was largely put in place to prevent the spread of mad cow disease, which was a major problem in the 80s and 90s, largely in Europe, but more accurately around the United Kingdom, Ireland, and France. Even those who traveled or lived in these countries at any point in the 80s and 90s were essentially barred from donating blood, a bar that Canada Blood Services and Health Canada speculate kept about 70,000 people from donating blood.
Wow, wowie, wowie.
When questioned as to why the ban is being lifted now, Canada Blood Services medical officer Dr. Aditi Kandwal had this to say.
By removing that criteria, we will not impact the safety of the blood supply. But what we may be able to do is improve access to being a donor for many, many new people and even donors who have been recently deferred from donation for these reasons.
In line with Canada actually removing this ban, much of the world already has, including the United States and Australia that removed the ban back in 2022. This sweeping change will come into effect across the country on Monday, December 4th of this year, which is a happy bit of news for many, as Canada Blood Services is still reporting lower than desired levels of all types of blood and donors. I'm Glenn Dragonia, and you're listening to Let's Talk with Dani Stover.
You usually hear us on the radio, but there's another way to listen. Download the free Radio Player Canada app, and you can hear us anytime, anywhere.
Whether you're in the car, on a walk, or at home, you can hear all your favorite shows.
Toronto Today.
Alex Pearson, The Kelly Contreras Show.
Oakley Show, and a great afternoon for Talk Radio.
My name's Dani Stover. This is Let's Talk.
So download the Radio Player Canada app today.
Toronto's news. Today's Talk. 640 Toronto.
The toy industry actually grew by 30% between 2019 and 2022. But this year, it's been declining. And before you go blaming the economy, what if it's not so much about the economy, but more about the changes to your shopping behavior? And think about it. If you wanted a rainbow Kush ball by this time tomorrow, you could have a rainbow Kush ball by this time tomorrow. And you wouldn't have to get up off your tush to get it. And you might even get free shipping. Fabulous. But what does this mean for businesses, brick and mortars, mom and pop shops, when it comes to the toy industry? And I struggle with this because I know how difficult it is during the holidays. You're spending hand over fist, and it never really feels like it's enough. And you're dashing and dancing and donning and getting blitzened. But my struggle comes from the fact that it's just so much. All the stuff, all the packaging, the returns, it's trash. It hurts my heart to think of it all sometimes. It makes me feel like a Grinch because I want you to find all the things you want and need for the holidays. I want you to get a great deal, but I also want the local shops, the people in your communities that run these independent toy stores to flourish. But you can't always get what you want, and things are changing. And there are also some weird habits that, again, if you need to nickel and dime to get by right now, that's totally fair. But just consider the fact that hundreds of millions of items that Canadians send back to the store every year end up in the landfill. And if you're saving $3 by buying something through Amazon, maybe think about the people working at that brick and mortar toy shop in your community. They could be struggling too. Happy holidays, huh? Marvin Ryder is a professor with the DeGroote School of Business at McMaster University, and he joined Rick Zamprin on 900 CHML in Hamilton to talk about what this funny business in the toy industry is all about.
There are two problems with selling toys. Problem number one is to figure out what consumers want each year. Novelty drives consumers, and so, for instance, this is the year of Barbie. Hasbro doesn't have Barbie, and so those fortunes are worse, but next year Barbie won't be the it toy. Something else will be. So Hasbro's challenge is always to innovate and try to find that toy that everybody wants to give. The other challenge that's going on here, of course, is I think it's really the rise of Amazon. Now, and that leads to two things. First is that when people shop in a bricks and mortar store, they've always got their phone handy. So I'm looking around and I see something I like for my child. I wonder what the price of it is on Amazon. So you whip out your phone and compare prices. And it puts a lot of pressure on retailers to have a price that is similar. The other thing that's happening, of course, is that with Amazon, everybody and their brother, much like they have a Costco membership, now have an Amazon Prime membership. Why is that important? Well, you do it because you probably want the videos and the music, but it also gets you discounts on shipping. So once upon a time when we would order something from Amazon, you'd have to say, oh, will it arrive in time? Will it be here? And what's the cost of the shipping? Yeah, that's a great price, but I have to pay $10 to have it shipped. I'd rather buy the thing in store. Because more and more people have Amazon Prime memberships, they're able to reduce the cost of shipping. And Amazon, in turn, is also finding faster ways to get it to your home. So we're seeing a lot more competition on bricks and mortar stores through online stores like Amazon.
I think most people, too, who have an Amazon membership, and as you said, probably got it just to watch, Amazon Prime Video, but also, hey, I'm spending this money anyways. Why not just shop at Amazon? I can get a discount on delivery.
Right. And then what this leads then to this idea of comparison shopping, where people used to ask the question, is it worth my while to go from one physical store to another? Oh, I'm not going to drive all the way to this mall or that mall. Look, that's a good enough price. I'll buy it. But now you're sitting in the store. This is what we're seeing actually in the stores. You're there. You're looking at an item. Do I take it off the shelf? And then we've also seen people, if you will, buying it as a backup plan. So the first thing they'll ask a retailer is, what's your return policy on this? I'm going to buy one because I'm not sure the Amazon delivery will arrive on time. But if it does, I'll keep the Amazon item and I'm going to bring this item back to the retail store. So even once I make a sale, if I have a return policy, I may not be able to keep that sale once the Amazon product arrives. And that's the strategy. I don't think it's so much that this is a difficult year for retailers. There's a lot of people who want to say, oh, it's a difficult economy, things are bad all over. And really, it's not. We're not seeing any sign of it. In the United States, this year might cross, Christmas shopping might cross $1 trillion.
Wow.
The best estimate at the moment is $980 billion, but you don't need much variation from that to get you to $1 trillion. It could be a record year of shopping. The economy is not doing that badly, but our behavior is what's changed.
So still with high interest rates, we're still going out and shopping for toys.
We are. Now, they are relatively high, Rick. I guess that's worth noting.
Yeah.
The interest rates we now have in Canada and in the United States are actually pretty much the normal that we've seen over the last 150 years. Yes, they are much higher than they were just a couple of years ago when COVID was on, but everyone forgets that those interest rates were dramatically cut to try to keep the economy going. Now, they are probably going to be higher than they'll be a year from now. We actually think by this time next year, 2024, interest rates will be down maybe a full percentage point cheaper. But whether it's 4% or 5%, people are going to spend the money. That's not enough to make a difference. The credit card rate might, but credit card rates haven't changed at all during this period.
When it comes to mom and pop shop toy stores, they must be really struggling, or are they?
Some of them are. Some of them definitely are, because of this idea that they're not just competing against other bricks and mortar stores that they know, but they're competing in this online world. Again, the trick, though, is to make up what you can't do on price on service. So I suspect what you're going to see is shoppers now over the next, what have we got left? 2 weeks until Christmas. You're going to see a lot of people who've left their shopping a little late, can't take the risk of something being delivered in time for Christmas. You don't want to disappoint those little faces. So they're going to get a lot of last minute demands, and how they respond to it will speak volumes as to what kind of a Christmas season they're going to have.
That was Marvin Ryder, a professor with the DeGroote School of Business at McMaster U, on 900 CHML with host Rick Zamprin. Still to come, I saw something on Instagram recently that made me think phones should absolutely not be in the classroom. It's a bit of a story, though, so stick around. I'm Dani Stover. That's next on Let's Talk.
Greetings.
Hey, welcome back. You're listening to Let's Talk. My name's Dani Stover. Are you on Instagram? That's where I spend most of my scrolling time, so you can find me there at Dani Stover. But for some reason, I follow way more people than I have followers. So for the past couple of months, I've been doing a big cleanse, a purge. My rules are, if I don't know you, you're a celebrity or something, or haven't interacted with you in a long time, you're not liking my stuff, you're gone. If you're a business or a restaurant that I've never been to and probably won't visit, I'm sorry, you gotta go. If you're an inactive account, dropped. And so I came across a meme account that I had followed for many years, and something to know about me. I'm a huge fan of RuPaul's Drag Race and the Drag Race franchise and drag in general. And so this was one of many accounts that provided me with some cheap entertainment. So on this account, I checked their last post, which was like earlier this year. And it said something like, hey, I started this account to share and connect with the community, and it brought me lots of joy. But sadly, I stopped being a fan of the show. And because I'm a senior in high school right now, things got really busy and I just couldn't find the time. Then it goes on to say, thanks for following along. Can't believe I started this account in grade 9 and was able to post 3 memes a day. Now, I love my phone, and you probably love your phone, but smartphones have a large impact on the mental health of young people, and some school boards are considering banning them from the classroom for good. Sachin Maharaj is an assistant professor of educational leadership, policy, and program evaluation at the University of Ottawa, and he joined host Angela Kokott on QR Calgary to talk about the problem and the potential solution.
I actually started my career as a teacher in the Toronto District School Board, and that was back in 2007 when they put their initial ban in place. And then 4 years later, they rescinded the ban largely because of pushback from parents, but also there was this thought that we need to embrace digital technologies, and as part of 21st century learning, that having students bring their phones into class would revolutionize learning in the classroom. But since then, what teachers have largely found is that these phones mostly serve as a distraction and are actually harming both the learning and social and emotional well-being of students. And so what's a little bit different now is that it seems more and more policymakers are receptive to this message from teachers, and we're seeing some changes to kind of restrict their use in the classroom.
And all those things you lay out, I can see it just makes sense. How does a teacher get kids to focus when they can be looking down at their lap, seeing what the latest TikTok video is? What has always been the most difficult part of this? Enforcement? I'm just trying to understand why this has been a tough ban to even consider.
Well, because phones are so powerful, in theory, they could support learning, right? They're basically supercomputers that a lot of kids are carrying around in their pockets. The problem is for the teacher trying to manage when it's being used for a learning purpose versus when it's not. Like, there's a real distinction between phones and other types of digital technologies. Like, if a teacher distributes Chromebooks or tablets in the classroom for a particular learning purpose and then can take it away, when they're not being used, that's a bit different than a phone, because these are kids' personal devices, and most of what's on them don't actually support learning. And so it becomes really difficult for teachers to police the dozens of students in their class about, when it's being used for learning versus when it's distracting. And so largely, teachers just give up, because if that's all they would be doing all class if they had to kind of monitor each student's individual phone use.
I always wondered if it wasn't possible, just as the kids walk into the class, they put the phone on the teacher's desk, and then I remember hearing arguments about, you can't take my phone, that's my private property. But it can't even be that simple.
I mean, it can, and some teachers have done this successfully. The problem is the inconsistent patchwork of enforcement. And so when there's no consistent policy across school districts or even within schools, individual teachers that want to take that approach, it just becomes that much more difficult, because there isn't that expectation that this is the norm when students enter the classroom. And as you mentioned, increasingly now students view this as their personal property, and these devices have become much more expensive, right? Like, a smartphone now can be over $1,000. And so giving that up feels really invasive to a lot of students and their parents, who are the ones that are purchasing these devices for their kids.
And I guess I was kind of surprised to hear in those early days of debates, parents were saying, well, no, you can't. That's my only link to my child. And I hate to be the person who says when I was a kid, but if my parents were trying to get a hold of me or I was trying to get a hold of them, you'd go to the office and say, I need to phone my mom or dad. But it's interesting to see the pushback from parents.
Yeah, there's this increased expectation now that parents can be in more continuous contact with their kids. As you know, if there is an emergency of some kind, parents still have the option of actually calling the school. The issue is when parents want to communicate with their kids for things that are way below that threshold, right? Like, it's more so about organizing maybe what's happening after school or checking in or something like that. But I think we also need to question what impact that is having on kids and their learning and their sort of sense of independence, because they're not just being interrupted by social media apps or messages from their friends. It's also communications from their parents as well during the school day.
My guest this afternoon is Sachin Maharaj, an assistant professor of educational leadership policy and program evaluation at the University of Ottawa. Just talking about a potential cell phone ban. Do we have to get them out of the classroom so kids can focus on what they are being taught? we hear so much also about the mental health that is tied to the need to have the phones in their hands. I almost wonder what would happen if a child for an hour-long class didn't have that in their hand. I mean, the mental health thing goes both ways, doesn't it, Sachin?
Yeah, and this is why these approaches really need to be done at a systemic level, because more and more of kids' social lives is online. An individual kid that withdraws from that, essentially they're in the worst of both worlds, right? Because they're missing out in terms of what's going on online. But if all of their friends are still on their phones, they're not getting those in-person socialization benefits either. So in order to see the benefits of this really needs to be done on kind of a system-wide basis. But there is increased cause for concern around the impact of social media in particular on kids' mental health. So earlier this year, the U.S. Surgeon General issued in a warning talking about the impact that social media is having on children. And later, so just a couple months ago, 41 American states launched a lawsuit against Meta, the parent company of Instagram and Facebook, because of the impact that those social media platforms are having on kids' mental health. And so when we see that, I think particularly in schools, we have a moral responsibility to try to curb some of that use. So right now, data from Ontario indicates that the average teen is spending over 3 hours per day on social media apps, and about a third of teens are spending over 5 hours per day. So that's quite a bit of time, and a lot of that is occurring during the school day as well. And so I think it's reasonable to have some sort of restrictions on that during the school day when kids are supposed to be focused on learning.
That was Sachin Maharaj, an assistant professor of educational leadership, policy, and program evaluation at the University of Ottawa. He joined host Angela Kokott on QR Calgary.
This is content producer Glenn Brigonia with another installment of
Did you hear?
This is where I keep you informed on the bits of news that could be slipping past your radar. But you definitely want to keep it at the top of your mind, especially if you're a woman in her 40s or 50s right about now. Like, did you hear the provincial government is lowering the age for publicly funded breast cancer screenings from 50 to 40?
It's about time.
Provincial Health Minister Sylvia Jones says that the move will open the doors for about 1 million people in Ontario.
This change, of course, will allow for up to an additional 1 million Ontarians to self-refer for a mammogram if they decide screening is right for them.
This opening up of the breast cancer screening policy is largely to help offset the disturbing amount of women who are diagnosed with breast cancer in Ontario every year.
Nearly 12,000 Ontarians are diagnosed with breast cancer each and every year. We know early detection through regular screening with mammograms can save lives.
And although much of this is great news, the change will not be coming into effect until 2024. Once again, this initiative can not only help save lives, but further promotes necessary upgrades how women's health is perceived in this country. But why wait until next year? Well, Health Minister Sylvia Jones says that her office is helping to determine how much staff will need to be hired to not further strain our already overburdened healthcare system within this province. I'm Glenn Bergonier, and you're listening to Let's Talk with Dani Stover.
Coming up, I just want to play you something. Listen to this. Does that sound bad to you? I think it sounds pretty good, but you may think it's terrible. And you're right, it is terrible. But that's the whole point. On the way, you'll learn more about RTOOT, which is short for the Really Terrible Orchestra of the Triangle, and I kind of want to join. My name's Dani Stover. That's next on Let's Talk. Hey, welcome back. You're listening to Let's Talk. My name's Dani Stover. What's stopping you from picking up an instrument and joining an orchestra? What, you're afraid you'll be terrible at it? Who cares? So what, big whoop? I'm trying this thing where I embrace my limitations, and part of that is accepting the limitations of others. And so if you're human, you're probably good at some things and not so good at other things. But let me ask you this. What do you enjoy doing? Like, I really enjoyed playing the trombone. And when I was in grade 7 and 8, for some reason, they let us all play instruments. And all I wanted to do was play that trombone because I really just wanted to make that cool sliding sound. And say what you will about band geeks, but I loved the feeling of creating music as a group. This was really my only exposure to music aside from the recorder and my experimental phase where my grandma would let me play her organ as a kid as long as I washed my hands and promised to wear headphones so that she didn't have to hear the, quote, music I was making. But when I played trombone in school, I was fascinated by the fact that apart, we were all just making individual and seemingly random sounds, but together, we could make a whole ass song. Fantastic. And listen to this. Does this sound bad to you? I think it sounds pretty cool. But there is a reason I didn't pursue band beyond grade 8. You may hear that and think it's terrible. And you're right. It is terrible. But that's the whole point. That is the Really Terrible Orchestra of the Triangle, or RTOT for short. And this is a full symphony orchestra in the U.S. with over 100 amateur musicians, and it's quite popular. Dr. Bob Petters is the conductor, and he joined Mornings with Simi on 980 CKNW to talk about the legacy of the Really Terrible Orchestra of the Triangle.
The founder, Sandy Hobgood, went to a concert in New York City of the Really Terrible Orchestra from Scotland. And he loved the idea. So he started the orchestra here in North Carolina with the same ideas. And the whole idea basically is if you don't want to play professionally, or if you haven't played for a while, or if you've just picked up an instrument, or if you're a professional trombonist who wants to play French horn, then you can play in this orchestra.
So the idea being that lots of people take, lessons or they grew up playing, but maybe that's as far as it got. This is a place for them.
Yes. We have a lot of players who played in high school and maybe college and then had families. And 30 years later, they picked up their instrument and they play with us.
And so what do you think it is about this by calling it really terrible that appeals to people?
And it's interesting because some people have said, it's not really terrible, but the name is stuck, and the players come. One, they know that there's no attendance policy, so if they have a conflict, they don't have to worry about being kicked out. And two, they don't have to play every note.
Wait a minute. What do you mean they don't have to play every note?
Well, I mean, if there's a passage that moves quickly and they don't have the experience to play all the notes, they play what they can. See, it's the joy of playing music. That's the whole thing. And they just do the best they can.
I love this idea. It's that, if that part's too hard, it's okay. Just sit that part out and join in when you feel confident again.
Exactly.
What do you think this is doing for the people who participate?
It gives them, again, the joy of playing music as amateurs. It's much more for the players than for the concert audience. But we do focus on rehearsing, and twice a year we do give a concert. But again, it's for the players.
Right, but Dr. Petters, those concerts are pretty popular, are they not?
Oh, yes. Yeah, they get pretty much sold out.
And how is it for you as the conductor? Is it more challenging when people are kind of jumping in and out of the music? Like, how do you do your job?
I've always been my whole career wanting to work with amateurs, music lovers. And I've taught public school for 7 years and done a lot of college conducting. But again, it's for the amateurs, the music lovers. That's who I enjoy working with.
So can anybody join?
We've had people who have just started playing, wanted to play in an orchestra, and they come and they don't play all the notes, but they enjoy themselves. Now we've had a couple people, we said, you're too good for us.
I was going to ask that question. Like, what happens when somebody shows up and you go, wait a minute, what are you doing here?
Exactly. Yeah. But on the other hand, like I say, we have a professional trombonist who's playing French horn.
Wow.
And we have a professional flutist who's playing cello. So if
Why?
they want to play another instrument, they're certainly welcome.
Although, this brings up a good point, though, Dr. Petters, is that sometimes do we get boxed in so early, right? If somebody takes lessons and they're half decent on the flute, well, that's it. They're playing the flute for the next 20, 30 years, and maybe they never really wanted to.
Yeah, sometimes that happens, but I don't think we have any of those in the orchestra.
That was Dr. Bob Petters, the conductor of the Really Terrible Orchestra of the Triangle, on Mornings with Simi on our sibling station in Vancouver, 980 CKNW.
This is content producer Glenn Brigonia with another installment of Get to Know Your Bill.
I'm just a bill. Yes, I'm only a bill.
In this installment, we're going to be looking into the recently tabled Bill C-61, an act representing water, source water, drinking water, wastewater, and related infrastructure on First Nation lands.
Shorter name?
Actually, yes, I'm glad you asked. There is a short title, which is what we'll use from now on for all of our sanity. And it's called the First Nations Clean Water Act.
Next time, leave it that.
I know. Nobody needs to hear the full title because they're always just terrible. But we do need to mention it at least once. However, moving on, then, like I said, we'll stick with a short title. This long-promised and heavily important bill was just introduced by the Federal Minister of Indigenous Services, Patty Haiju, on December 11th, and has already completed its first rounds of readings in the House of Commons. So, what's it all about then? The name, at least the name in the short title, should be pretty self-explanatory. It's supposed to ensure that all First Nations communities across this country have access to consistent, clean, and potable drinking water, which is something the current Liberal government has previously promised and has failed to do.
Surprise, surprise.
In 2015, the Liberals committed to ending long-standing boil water advisories in First Nations communities and pledged to have this done by 2021. A deadline they set, a deadline that has come and gone, with communities still without access to clean drinking water in Canada. Something opposition parties, concerned citizens, First Nation communities, and other activists has heavily criticized the federal government for. This new bill is set to ensure that the federal government commits to providing funding that is comparable to that provided by other levels of government. Drinking water standards and quality are determined by the feds and First Nations together, and finally building necessary infrastructure not only for clean drinking water, but also to safely deal with and dispose of wastewater. Indigenous Services Minister Patty Haiju says that right now First Nations do not have the tools to monitor the water coming into their communities, and our government has to be doing better.
Right now, First Nations don't have the tools they need to protect or monitor the water flowing into their communities. And all too often, that means that water is silently contaminated or rendered unusable, creating unacceptable health and safety conditions along with grief and fear.
Cowassess First Nation Chief Erica Bowden calls this a historic day for Indigenous peoples to finally get a clear path to drinking water.
It is a start, a beautiful start for all of us to work together with the covenant of treaty, our inherent rights as Indigenous people and all people who inhabit these lands to work together for the cleanest, the safest water that all of us could drink.
But, as you remember I just said, this isn't the first time this federal government has introduced similar legislation or even made promises that were not followed through with. And just because this has been finally introduced does not mean this bill is close to achieving its royal assent just yet. It has only completed its first of 3 reading stages in the House of Commons and will have to go through at least another 3 in the Senate before it ascends. So we could actually be waiting a little bit longer before this is actually in place. Now, some of this may seem daunting and a little confusing to you, but these bills play a massive role in many of our lives, and we will continue to do features such as this to help you stay as informed and up to date as possible. I'm Glenn Bergonier, and you're listening to Let's Talk with Dani Stover.
Welcome back to Let's Talk with Dani Stover.
Have you ever been to Detroit? I went a couple of months ago, and I gotta say, I was obsessed. It's a really cool city that I know has had a rough history. But there is awesome architecture, cool diners, lots of art, friendly people. I didn't see one piece of garbage, and everything is pretty much 10 minutes away. So one of the things I noticed, Detroit had a lot of strawberry box houses. And this is the name they're given because they're in the shape of a strawberry box. Adorable. You might know them as Victory homes or simplified Cape Cod style. They're wartime homes, and they're everywhere in Canada. And they're everywhere in Canada because during and after World War II, affordable housing was needed fast, much like it is today. And you've heard politicians say over and over and over, we need a wartime effort to build housing. And maybe this is it. So from the 1940s through to the 60s, over 1 million of these Victory and Strawberry Box homes were constructed all across the country. Only difference is that back then, these wartime homes were initially offered as rentals for the rate of, oh gosh, are you ready? $22 and $30 per month, which with today's inflation would still be pretty cheap, just over $500 a month for a whole house. Now later, tenants were offered the option to purchase their home for as low as $6,000. $6,000? I think I have that on me. Now, how would these prices look today in this economy? Keeping up with inflation in 2023, this would shake out to about $375 to $512 monthly for rent. I mean, I'm into it. The price is right. But I've always wanted to live inside of a whimsical strawberry box with a quaint yard, maybe a little driveway, a roof, and 4 walls. Oh, divine. So what's standing in the way of getting these types of homes built fast and affordably? Well, it's one less thing than before. Housing Minister Sean Fraser announced that the Liberal government will hold consultations to relaunch a program called the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation. This would provide standardized, pre-approved housing blueprints to builders. It's a throwback to the days of wartime housing from the 40s through to the 70s. Mike Moffat is the Senior Director of Policy and Innovation at the Smart Prosperity Institute, and he joined the Alex Pearson Show to talk about this catalog and how this all came about again.
A number of us groups got together and put out something called the National Housing Accord, which is a series of recommendations to the federal government. And we had everyone from builders to developers to investors to homelessness advocates come up with a series of suggestions. And this one is reintroducing the catalog of designs was, I think, recommendation 7 on the list. And it's nice to see them move on it.
What is the reality of how much we could build of this wartime housing? Because it's very simplistic housing, right? Like it's cookie cutter housing.
Yeah, so how this catalog would work is that it would be a series of designs, and this is not something new. The federal government had this starting in 1947 and going through the 1970s. That is a set of blueprints that builders and developers could choose from, and they would be designed in such a way that they would be sort of easy to put together. They wouldn't be labor intensive to build. You can make them, certain levels of energy efficiency or so on. And the benefits to this, first of all, it's a lot cheaper because you're not paying, for sets of architectural designs over and over.
Where would they go and how would it work as far as designing communities around them?
Yeah, absolutely. So it could work basically how neighborhoods are designed now. So you think of a typical suburban neighborhood where you might have 6 or 7 different models out there, and the builder kind of builds which one ever people want. It's kind of the same thing that you would have multiple house designs in this catalog. And builders and developers could be free to choose those, or they can continue building whatever they like. So nothing sort of a requirement here. It's just a way that if a builder or developer wants to speed up a process and build something that's a little bit less labor intensive, those blueprints are already available to them at free or nominal charge.
And the big key to this would be cutting all that permitting and all the delays that you get with zoning and all that stuff. Save about 12 months on buildings. So theoretically, you could have, I guess, in a perfect world, a lot of these things built within a year.
Well, ideally, yeah. Now, it's going to take time, obviously, to put these catalogs together, but particularly for something like a 6-story mid-rise type apartment, everything from the municipal approvals to getting finance and insurance from the CMHC can take years and years. So, this could easily cut a year or more off of that process. So, these things aren't going to get built overnight, but it's going to be substantial time savings, and time is money. So,
I think this is going to be a way to really drive affordability in this market, again, assuming that government is able to implement this well.
Yeah, I mean, they actually have to pull the trigger. But you said that there were builders in that meeting. And one thing I hear about builders is that we don't have enough of them, right? And so what was the feedback from them?
Well, can't tell tales at a church, but overall, I think the response that we're hearing from builders and developers is that they're happy to have this because it creates some options. That if a builder doesn't want to use anything from that catalog, they're not required to. So, but if they want to choose to go into this market, and it's a way for builders and developers to get into markets that they haven't used in the past, and that could be, again, anything from fourplexes to building, 6-story mid-rise mass timber apartments. So it's just a way to allow builders and developers to increase the types of units that they're building.
Right, but we do have a shortage in this area of construction workers, and so the big hindrance, I think, is going to be, it's one thing to get the program up and running, but if we can't get the labor in, it still poses the same problem. Like, we have more than one problem, and they're all colliding at the same time.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, the catalog actually helps with that quite a bit, or at least if it's done correctly, because the designs that go into the catalog should be made in a way that they're easier to put together. Having what we call labor-efficient designs are important. So absolutely, that is probably the number one bottleneck for us to reaching our housing ambitions. But if we do this correctly, that actually helps with that. That, we can cut down on the man hours needed to build a home by 20 or 30% if we have the right types of design.
Right. And look, I'm looking at the prices. They were talking about this in the Waterloo region, but we're looking at a price tag of about $821,000 just in that region. So what would you set the price of one of these things in Toronto?
Well, it would be, it'd still be incredibly expensive because obviously it's not just the design cost. But it's, also the land cost. So, there's a lot of further things that are needed to produce the land. But the important thing to note here is it's not government isn't the one building these things, or at least it doesn't have.
We'd never get anything built if that were the case. Goodness.
This is just a catalog that a builder or developer could choose from, or, like back in the 1950s, an average person could go to the catalog and go, ooh, I really like that. And then go to a company and say, hey, I've got this land. Can you build this for me? Can you build this for me right here? So, that would certainly go a long way.
By the way, why was it stopped? Why did it become like a non-thing? Was it just that people decided to go into a different aesthetic and they just became out of fashion? What was the reason that those blueprints went away?
Yeah, I think over time, the catalog was updated every year, but I think some of the designs were getting stale. We had in the 1970s, late 1970s, building starts started to fall off because of a series of recessions. So this thing kind of just fell by the wayside. It felt like it wasn't needed at the time, but. Our conditions look a lot more like the ones at the end of the World War II. So, we introduced it back then, worked back then, and I think it would today.
Me too. That was Mike Moffat, Senior Director of Policy and Innovation at the Smart Prosperity Institute on the Alex Pearson Show. On the way next, a few months ago, I had the pleasure of interviewing Nick Offerman, and he was the kindest man. Offerman performs some comedic parody songs. That's why we were chatting a few months ago, and he told me that one of his bits is, how is there global warming when my beer is still cold? And this is an example of two opposing things that are true. But there is something that opposing truths can tell us, and the ways they can help us find some middle ground or even hope in a world that is feeling pretty hopeless. I'm Dani Stover. I hope you'll stick around because that's next on Let's Talk. Living in fear, awake, only to try and survive another day. There is hunger. There is thirst. There is isolation, hate, anger, addiction, disease, grief, imbalance, inequality. The list could go on and on and on. But of course, darkness cannot exist without the light. And so there is also peace, birth, sovereignty, progress, passion, celebration. There are people inventing the next amazing tool that could save thousands of lives. There is generosity. There is fulfillment and satisfaction. There are breakthroughs and cures. There is equity and growth. This list could also go on and on and on. I learned a new word today, dialectical. And if you knew what this word meant already, you get 1 gold star. But dialectical in philosophy is used to describe situations, theories, and procedures which depend on resolving opposing factors. It's a method of examining and discussing opposing ideas in order to find the truth. So, for example, a dialectical situation would be when you're in a large group of people, yet you feel very, very alone. Or if you're out shopping on a December Saturday and it's unseasonably mild, you're like, oh, I wore too big of a jacket. Or if you're experiencing a craving, and yet you're trying really, really hard to stay sober. 2 things that seem opposite and are at the same time true. Dialectical thinking refers to the ability to view issues from multiple perspectives and to arrive at the most economical and reasonable outcome. I will not give in to this craving because I'm the designated driver, or because I know I'll feel better if I don't. That's a reasonable outcome based on 2 opposing things being true. And I think it also honors both things being true. I do feel like maybe this is something that is lacking in the world right now in a more general sense. And I have some thoughts to add after you hear this. Simon Apolloni is an assistant professor with the School of the Environment at U of T. He joined Shay Ganam on QR Calgary to talk about trying to stay hopeful in a world that seems beyond saving, and how he promotes dialectical thinking in the classroom. Have a listen.
I think it's important to remind ourselves that while things are bad, it's not the end of the story. And again, this is not negating what the science is telling us about, for instance, climate change. It's real, it's dark, and it's very scary. However, there are also numerous cases where we've seen humans do marvelous work in regenerating rivers, saving wildlife, lowering emissions, not necessarily globally, and also even finding new ways of getting our energy. The amount of, for example, the amount of solar and wind energy, renewable energy, has grown exponentially, far greater than experts would have thought. And that's hopeful.
Yeah. How important is hope?
Oh, definitely. And it's not a naive hope. It's not a naive belief that, everything will turn out well. No, the hope I talk about, and I talk about it with my students, it's dark, it's daring, and it's dialectical. Dark meaning we see the reality, we don't deny it. It has to be accepted. Daring, it involves action. We have to get out there and we have to do something active to what we can. I mean, the problem is not one individual, it's systemic rather. And the other one, dialectical, it's not all dark. It's also showing the good. So dialectical thinking is sort of thinking, having 2 opposing thoughts in your head at the same time.
That's work.
Bad, but it's a lot of work, yes.
How do you encourage people or, try and make that something that's a little easier to do?
It's hard. Sometimes you just have to stop the class. One of my classes is with 500 students, and you can feel the tension when after I spew out all sorts of statistics of how we're going down the drain in this way and that. And I say, okay, let's just stop. Let's just breathe. And I actually instruct 500 students to take a minute, breathe in, breathe out, and then I show them something else that is a positive reaction. And I show them that, hey, yeah, it's dire, but it's not the end. But there's another part to this hope, is that it can't be done alone. And I urge them to find friends, people of like minds to talk with them.
That was Simon Apolloni, assistant professor with the School of the Environment at the University of Toronto. He joined host Shay Genham on QR Calgary. Now, there's something about this that I will admit I'm struggling with. I'm not totally sure that I'm going to do a good job of explaining, but my gourd, am I going to try? I think it all stems from why I was drawn to the term dialectical, and maybe why I was drawn to a conversation about finding hope in a world that seems beyond hope in the first place. And I think what I'm experiencing, and maybe you're experiencing this too, but I think it's best described by Palestinian writer Nikki Katura. Quote, "My friend leaves the faucet running while they put the dishes away, and I think of Gaza. I wake up parched, and I think of Gaza. I open the door of my home, and I think of Gaza. I sit in silence, and I think of Gaza. I throw out the produce I bought that has gone bad, and I think of Gaza. I'm hungry, and I think of Gaza. I eat, and I think of Gaza. I'm full, and I think of Gaza." Again, those words are from writer Nikki Katura, and maybe that doesn't resonate with you, but I found it to be a very profound way of describing the dichotomy. For me, it brings up sadness, anger, and hopelessness, even in the moments where I feel like I should feel happy, joyful, and optimistic. I'm not saying you should feel one way or the other. It's not an either or. In my opinion, it's a both and. Still to come, a platform shoe, a high heel, a pink pillowcase, and a syringe. These are just 4 of the 14,000 items collected as part of the Robert Pickton case, which was considered to be the largest serial killer investigation in Canadian history. So why then would the RCMP be dumping tens of thousands of pieces of evidence? And why is this a problem? I'm Dani Stover. You'll find out next on Let's Talk.
Presidents to represent me. I'm out for presidents to represent me. I'm out for presidents to represent me.
You're listening to Let's Talk. My name's Dani Stover. In the early 90s, Robert Pickton inherited his family pig farm in Port Coquitlam, BC. In 2002, police executed a search warrant for illegal firearms at the property. Both Pickton and his brothers were arrested, but based on what they saw, police obtained a second warrant to search the farm as part of the BC Missing Women investigation. This time, they discovered personal items belonging to missing women. Pickton was convicted in 2007 of the second-degree murders of 6 women and was also the subject of a lengthy investigation that yielded evidence of numerous other murders. Pickton was charged with the deaths of an additional 20 women, many of them from Vancouver's downtown east side. But these charges were stayed by the Crown in 2010 because he was already serving the max sentence, life in prison, with no possibility of parole for 25 years, which at the time was the longest possible sentence for second-degree murder under Canadian law. During the trial's first day of jury evidence, the Crown stated that Pickton had confessed to 49 murders to an undercover agent from the Office of the Inspector General who was posing as a cellmate. The Crown reported that Pickton told the officer that he wanted to kill another woman to make it an even 50, and he was caught because he was, quote, sloppy. It's been 21 years since his initial arrest, and now the RCMP are looking to get rid of 14,000 pieces of evidence that was collected during the investigation. This got me thinking about how long police departments usually hold on to evidence, and what I found was it depends. Anywhere from the closing of the case until the end of time. Dr. Sasha Reed is a Calgary law student and creator of the most comprehensive serial killer database in the world. You'll hear her voice on this first. She is joined by Sue Brown, Director of Advocacy and Staff Lawyer at Justice for Girls. They both hopped on 980 CKNW with host Jill Bennett to talk about why the RCMP should not dump the evidence and what they'll do if these items are destroyed.
My thoughts on this move is it's unconscionable. We've had conversations with several family members, not just a couple, but quite a few family members who, one, were completely unaware of what was happening. They're completely blindsided by this. They're furious, they're upset, they don't want this to go forward. They do not give their permission to have this go forward. They want the investigations of their missing, murdered loved ones to be solved, and they believe there are other people involved in these crimes, not just Robert Pickton. These are unsolved, open, ongoing investigations.
And Sue Brown, I'll bring you in as well. Again, Director of Advocacy, staff lawyer at Justice for Girls. Your thoughts on this move?
Well, we're seriously concerned, and we're left with significant questions as to what exactly the RCMP has been doing with these cases for the past 10 years and why they're seeking to dispose of these exhibits now. As far as we're concerned, they have an obligation to thoroughly and adequately investigate unsolved cases, particularly involving marginalized and Indigenous women and girls. And we expect that they should do everything within their power to investigate these cases thoroughly prior to closing these cases. And their move now to dispose of this evidence, whether it is to return it or whether it is to destroy it or whether it is to dispose it, that is splitting hairs as far as we're concerned. If they lose chain of custody of this evidence and they don't preserve the evidential integrity of it, they're seriously compromising the potential for other perpetrators who were involved in these missing and murdered cases to be brought to justice.
Is that happening, though, do you think, in that we know that Robert Pickton was convicted in the cases that he is now serving a life sentence for, but there was other DNA. There certainly were more women murdered, but that, and I know that was contentious at the time. Doesn't that kind of show that even with all of this evidence still in storage, these are not active investigations?
Well, they should be. Robert Pickton was only convicted of 6 of those murders. 20 of those charges were stayed, and there were multiple other women who disappeared from the downtown east side who can be connected to Pickton or otherwise unsolved cases. And it's the RCMP's legal obligation to investigate these cases until they are solved and to leave them open.
And just to add on to that, I think the RCMP presumptively determined that the other suspects were more witnesses rather than co-accused, and they spoke to them as though they were witnesses and not co-accused. And I think because there was that preemptive determination that they were not involved, this has never actually been investigated the way it should have been.
So when the RCMP come out and say, and one of the spokespersons talked to Post Media News saying that these are things like items of clothing that were found in the trailer. These are not things that have DNA still on them. That in fact, the quote was, "There is no point in keeping this evidence to identify possible additional suspects because police have exhausted all leads to identify any accomplices." It sounds like there's not an agreement there.
This has been a significantly flawed investigation from the beginning that led to a very scandalously flawed commission of inquiry. I don't think the families and I don't think the public has the trust in the RCMP at this time to believe what they're saying, that they have exhausted all leads. And that's certainly the evidence that we have from the RCMP does not give us faith that they have.
The fact that 20 years later, families still have questions and feel that this is unresolved in and of itself means that we need to do more. There has never been sufficient answers in this case.
Is it important, though, as well, for some, I know some of the items have been given back to the families. If there are items that are deemed not evidence in that there's nothing, not that of value, but of value specifically to an investigation, if police deem that, is it important to give those items back and then still keep things that could potentially be evidence?
There is a process in the criminal code, which is what the police are pursuing under Section 490, which allows for the disposal of items that don't have any further investigative value. We simply don't believe that the 14,000 exhibits that the RCMP is seeking to dispose of, whether they're returning it to the family or otherwise, is not of investigative value, particularly because the investigation has been so flawed. And we can also point to the fact that 5 previous applications have gone forward in court with no notice to the families or no adequate notice to the family such that they knew and meaningfully understood and could participate in those processes. And some of those exhibits included evidence from Burns Road, evidence from Pat Casanova's car, evidence from the Jane Doe Ruskin site, and another ex parte application for things perishable. We don't believe that those pieces of evidence didn't have investigative value. We don't believe what the RCMP are saying.
Right, and when you mentioned the Jane Doe site, is that not, if I'm remembering correctly, is that it's DNA that was found, but has never been, the pieces have never been connected, the dots have not been connected. That's still very much an open case.
Yes. Very much.
So does it seem strange that there are, even though the RCMP are saying there's no investigative value to keeping these, there are cases, clearly there is at least one, probably more cases that have not been solved?
You don't know the investigative value of a piece of evidence until you know it. And you can find that out 20 years later, 30 years later, 40 years later. And we see that happening in unsolved cases all around the world, all the time. There's advancements in technology and DNA that allow for DNA to be extracted or the evidentiary value of something to come clear, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years after it was retrieved. So...
And Sasha, is that something you see as well with your database? Again, you have this comprehensive serial killer database. Is that one of the values there as well, of that those things do change and more evidence does lead to more breakthroughs?
Yeah, I honestly just believe that you don't know the investigative value of something until you know the investigative value. And that's what we're seeing here. You cannot, under any circumstance, say there's no investigative value when families have never been questioned, they've never been asked about, they've never been told about this, you've never actually had a real investigation into this in the first place. You can't say it has no investigative value. You don't know.
So what happens at this point then? This is the RCMP asking for the court's approval to give a lot of pieces back, to destroy other pieces. Is there a court challenge? What happens now?
We're hoping that the RCMP are going to hear our call now and that they're going to withdraw these applications and spare the families from having to go through the devastating process of having the evidentiary value assessed by the court. The families, I think their public statements have made it clear that they are absolutely traumatized and devastated by this last step, at least the families we're in contact with. Should the court applications proceed, I believe the families will be seeking to have their voices heard in court.
And Sasha, anything you don't want to add to that?
No, that's exactly correct. So if we are not able to have a moratorium placed on these disposition applications now, we'll see you in court.
That was Dr. Sasha Reed, Calgary law student and creator of the most comprehensive serial killer database in the world, and Sue Brown, director of advocacy and a staff lawyer at Justice for Girls. They joined host Jill Bennett on 980 CKNW in Vancouver. Coming up, did you know that Big Brothers, which is now Big Brothers and Sisters, began in the United States in 1904? A court clerk in New York City was noticing more and more boys coming through his courtroom, and he saw the need for mentorship. The program soon began with only 39 volunteers, and by 1916, Big Brothers had spread to 96 cities across the U.S. Now, Canada picked up on it too in 1913, and the not-for-profit is appealing for not just one-on-one mentors, but for entire corporations to get involved. I'm Dani Stover, and you'll find out how next on Let's Talk. Hey, welcome back. You're listening to Let's Talk. My name's Dani Stover. Every time I hear something about Big Brothers and Sisters, I think, I gotta look into that. I think I'd be good at it, seeing that I already am a big sister. No big deal. And I think it would be a really rewarding experience. Big Brothers and Sisters Canada has been around since 1913, if you can believe it. The movement across the country provides services to more than 41,000 youth in over 1,000 communities. The youth program began in the United States in 1904. Court clerk Ernest Coulter saw more and more boys coming through his New York City courtroom, and he saw the need for mentorship. Now, the program soon began with 39 volunteers, mainly friends of Coulter, and by 1916, Big Brothers had spread to 96 cities across the U.S. Now, the program is intended for youth between the ages of 6 and 18 who often come from single-parent households and low-income neighborhoods. But as you'll hear, that's not always the case, especially with their corporate mentorship program. According to one study that looked at youth participation over an 18-month follow-up period, these kids were significantly less likely to have started using illegal drugs or alcohol, resort to violence, or skip school. They were also more confident about their school performance and got along better with their families. Jillian Patton is with Big Brothers and Sisters Edmonton, and Shahab Shagian is from EPCOR and is a mentor himself. They joined this morning with Stacey Brotzel and Darren McIntyre on 630 CHED to talk about how it works and how you could get involved.
Basically, the corporate mentoring program is where local businesses or organizations partner with BGC Bigs, and we see their employees who want to be involved get matched with children at a local school for an hour of one-on-one mentoring. Often takes place over the lunch hour. It could take place at the place of work, or the mentors could travel to the school to visit with the kids. But it's a really easy way to be involved while you're at work with your work colleagues, and really to have a positive impact on local kids.
So they sometimes can bring the kids to you?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
With our get on the bus?
We bus those kiddos, you bet. Over the lunch hour, they enjoy their lunch at school before they come. They hop on the bus. They get to go see where grown-ups are working, which can be very exciting, and spend an hour with a really treasured friend.
It does sound different than the regular program. Mm-hmm. So it's not like the individual mentor program.
It's very similar, actually, and we always try to have those one-to-one matches. Again, I'm making an appeal for volunteers because we often have more kids than we do volunteers. So occasionally, a mentor will have more than one mentee, but that's okay. There's lots of value to that small group relationship as well. But wherever possible, we like that one-to-one relationship, just so we can focus on developing those positive social skills, supporting literacy and positive relationship development.
So sometimes the kids go to the EPCOR building, and sometimes you go to the kids' school. How does it work for you?
So the kids come to the facility that I'm working, and the last fall there was another program that they were coming to another facility, and it's during our lunch hour. Everything is set up perfectly. The matches were awesome, and we spent an hour doing activities with the kids.
And what are those conversations like? I guess they could be about what you're doing for a job, but I suspect when you're getting around kids, those conversations can go on any topic.
First, I was paired with smaller kids, grade 3 and now grade 2. They are not really interested in jobs yet. They're more looking for somebody to play and do activities like reading and everything else.
Hey, Stacey, we're in grade 3. Cool. But tons of fun.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely.
Are they the same kids that you sort of build a relationship with, or are they different kids?
It goes based on the school year. Mm-hmm. And then it changes to another class. So the new class that I'm working with, they're from grade 2, another school. So they change. But when I'm assigned and paired with a couple of kids, they stay with me till the end of the program.
I have a question for both of you, but I think you're going to come at it from different points of view. So Shahab, what do you get out of this program? What does EPCOR get out of this program from your point of view?
So it's interesting. At EPCOR, we always say we want to give back to the community, and that's everywhere. We see that everywhere on the wall, everywhere, basically. For me personally, when I joined the program, I felt that I was the one who was getting back something. It was an amazing experience, very calming, very peaceful, and I can't even stress how good it was. I think I got 100 times more than the kids.
Peaceful? With a bunch of grade 2 students?
Yes.
The peace came afterward.
Afterwards, yes.
So, Jillian, I guess I would ask you to answer it from two prongs. What do you think they get? And what does Big Sisters, Big Brothers get?
Oh, my goodness. So the feedback I consistently get back from mentors, echoes exactly what Shahab said. I think a lot of times volunteers come in thinking about what they're going to be able to offer to a child, what the child's going to be able to learn from them, and definitely our kids do benefit greatly from that 1 hour time that our volunteers give. But actually, the mentors gain a lot too. They learn skills that they didn't know they had, talents, abilities, and I think it's just that feel good feeling, and so often I have feedback that people say that was so much easier than I thought it was going to be.
Well, kids are scary.
Nervous.
They're frightening.
But yeah, so I think there's so much benefit all around, and certainly for BGC Bigs, we love the corporate program because, as you so beautifully said there at the beginning, we are seeking volunteers. We have wait lists in all of our programs, and if corporate mentoring is a way that can make this more accessible to people to volunteer, then that's wonderful.
So if there's a corporation listening right now, where do they start? What do they do? How do they know if they're the right fit?
You bet. So the very first thing I think would be to go to our website, get in contact with BGC Bigs to schedule a lunch and learn. And our enrollment team, our recruitment team will come out, do a presentation to any employees who are interested in participating. We'll give you all the information, can certainly talk about schools in the area, look at our programming and how we can start that partnership.
Why do these kids need somebody else in their lives? Is it they're missing somebody in their lives?
Definitely not. Everybody can benefit from a mentor. I don't think there's anybody in this world who says, I have enough friends and enough support. I don't really need anybody else to
certainly
encourage
there
me.
are certain schools, right? You're not taking Riverbend schools.
Certainly. We do, actually. We have schools across the city. Absolutely. Yeah, everybody is a candidate to have a mentor. Definitely, we have certain kiddos or school situations where maybe life is a little bit more complex. We have, kiddos who maybe are affected by poverty. We have kiddos who maybe have suffered loss in their families or have different complex family needs. But in general, I think any kiddo, benefits from a mentor, from a little bit of one-on-one time, to focus on their literacy, to focus on their interests, to build that confidence. So I think anybody could benefit from a mentor, myself included.
All right. I'll look into becoming a big. That was Jillian Patton and Shahab Bashagian with Big Brothers and Sisters Edmonton and EPCOR, which is a participating business in the corporate mentorship program. They joined this morning with Stacey Brotzel and Darren McIntyre on 630 CHED.
This is content producer Glenn Brigonia with another installment of
Did You Hear?
This is where we talk about the bits of news that could be slipping past your radar. And if you did not hear about the one-armed escapee that bit a woman in a small rural town, well, do I have a story to share with you?
That can't be real, right?
Yeah, okay, fine. You caught me there. I was being intentionally vague because the story that I'm talking about involves a one-armed baboon escaping from its residential home and biting a woman before being recaptured in a small northern Ontario town called Latchford.
No, it wasn't me. It was the one-armed man.
Sorry, I just needed to get that out of my system. But it's done, so let's go back to the story. This baboon escape actually happened in November, and that baboon, who is named Mark, was on the lam for about an hour, in which time it bit a woman in her 40s, which is now prompting that town and all towns in the surrounding region to completely overhaul existing exotic animal bylaws. As it stands in the province of Ontario, unless the municipality specifically bans exotic animals, it's not illegal to own them. Even if they are a well-recognized and hyper-aggressive animal that can easily take on and possibly even kill your average human. And I'm not exaggerating, just look up baboons, they're terrifying. So now Mark is at the center of a massive overhaul of existing and archaic rules set in place surrounding exotic animals, how to deal with them, and also how any of this could have been allowed at any point. The woman who was bit was observed for 14 days and was found to be relatively in good health, but this bite has barred her from donating blood or organs ever again, since baboon bites are known to pass on dangerous diseases such as tetanus, rabies, and possibly even herpes B.
Well, that's not good.
The only good news out of all of this is that nobody was seriously maimed or killed, as, once again, and I cannot emphasize this enough, baboons are possibly one of the most scary and least expected animals to attack you in Canada, especially in rural areas in the winter months.
Whew, I did not see that coming.
Neither did I. That was not on my bingo card for 2023. I'm Glenn Brigonia, and you're listening to Let's Talk with Dani Stover.
You're listening to Let's Talk with Dani Stover.
Hey, welcome back. You're listening to Let's Talk. My name's Dani Stover. Are you on Instagram? That's where I spend most of my scrolling time. So you can find me there at Dani Stover. But for some reason, I follow way more people than I have followers. So for the past couple of months, I've been doing a big cleanse, a purge. My rules are, if I don't know you, you're a celebrity or something, or haven't interacted with you in a long time, you're not liking my stuff, you're gone. If you're a business or a restaurant that I've never been to and probably won't visit, I'm sorry, you gotta go. If you're an inactive account, dropped. And so I came across a meme account that I had followed for many years, and something to know about me. I'm a huge fan of RuPaul's Drag Race and the Drag Race franchise and drag in general. And so this was one of many accounts that provided me with some cheap entertainment. So on this account, I checked their last post, which was like earlier this year. And it said something like, hey, I started this account to share and connect with the community, and it brought me lots of joy, but sadly, I stopped being a fan of the show, and because I'm a senior in high school right now, things got really busy, and I just couldn't find the time. Then it goes on to say, thanks for following along. Can't believe I started this account in grade 9 and was able to post 3 memes a day. Now, I love my phone, and you probably love your phone, but smartphones have a large impact on the mental health of young people, and some school boards are considering banning them from the classroom for good. Sachin Maharaj is an assistant professor of educational leadership, policy, and program evaluation at the University of Ottawa. And he joined host Angela Kokot on QR Calgary to talk about the problem and the potential solution.
I actually started my career as a teacher in the Toronto District School Board, and that was back in 2007 when they put their initial ban in place. And then 4 years later, they rescinded the ban largely because of pushback from parents, but also there was this thought that we need to embrace digital technologies, and as part of 21st century learning, that having students bring their phones into class would revolutionize learning in the classroom. But since then, what teachers have largely found is that these phones mostly serve as a distraction and are actually harming both the learning and social and emotional well-being of students. And so what's a little bit different now is that it seems more and more policymakers are receptive to this message from teachers, and we're seeing some changes to kind of restrict their use in the classroom.
And all those things you lay out, I can see it just makes sense. How does a teacher get kids to focus when they can be looking down at their lap, seeing what the latest TikTok video is? What has always been the most difficult part of this? Enforcement? I'm just trying to understand why this has been a tough ban to even consider.
Well, because phones are so powerful, in theory, they could support learning, right? They're basically supercomputers that a lot of kids are carrying around in their pockets. The problem is for the teacher trying to manage when it's being used for a learning purpose versus when it's not. Like, there's a real distinction between phones and other types of digital technologies. Like, if a teacher distributes Chromebooks or tablets in the classroom for a particular learning purpose and then can take it away, when they're not being used, that's a bit different than a phone, because these are kids' personal devices, and most of what's on them don't actually support learning. And so it becomes really difficult for teachers to police the dozens of students in their class about, when it's being used for learning versus when it's distracting. And so largely, teachers just give up, because if that's all they would be doing all class if they had to kind of monitor each student's individual phone use.
I always wondered if it wasn't possible, just as the kids walk into the class, they put the phone on the teacher's desk, and then I remember hearing arguments about, you can't take my phone, that's my private property. But it can't even be that simple.
I mean, it can, and some teachers have done this successfully. The problem is the inconsistent patchwork of enforcement. And so when there's no consistent policy across school districts or even within schools, individual teachers that want to take that approach, it just becomes that much more difficult, because there isn't that expectation that this is the norm when students enter the classroom. And as you mentioned, increasingly now students view this as their personal property, and these devices have become much more expensive, right? Like, a smartphone now can be over $1,000. And so giving that up feels really invasive to a lot of students and their parents, who are the ones that are purchasing these devices for their kids.
And I guess I was kind of surprised to hear in those early days of debates, parents were saying, well, no, you can't. That's my only link to my child. And I hate to be the person who says when I was a kid, but if my parents were trying to get a hold of me or I was trying to get a hold of them, you'd go to the office and say, I need to phone my mom or dad. But it's interesting to see the pushback from parents.
Yeah, there's this increased expectation now that parents can be in more continuous contact with their kids. As you know, if there is an emergency of some kind, parents still have the option of actually calling the school. The issue is when parents want to communicate with their kids for things that are way below that threshold, right? Like it's more so about organizing maybe what's happening after school or checking in or something like that. But I think we also need to question what impact that is having on kids and their learning and their sort of sense of independence, because they're not just being interrupted by social media apps or messages from their friends. It's also communications from their parents as well during the school day.
My guest this afternoon is Sachin Maharaj, an assistant professor of educational leadership, policy, and program evaluation at the University of Ottawa. Just talking about a potential cell phone ban. Do we have to get them out of the classroom so kids can focus on what they are being taught? We hear so much also about the mental health that is tied to the need to have the phones in their hands. I almost wonder what would happen if a child for an hour-long class didn't have that in their hand. I mean, the mental health thing goes both ways, doesn't it, Sachin?
Yeah, this is why these approaches really need to be done at a systemic level, because more and more of kids' social lives is online. An individual kid that withdraws from that, essentially they're in the worst of both worlds, right? Because they're missing out in terms of what's going on online. But if all of their friends are still on their phones, they're not getting those in-person socialization benefits either. So in order to see the benefits of this really needs to be done on kind of a system-wide basis. But there is increased cause for concern around the impact of social media in particular on kids' mental health. So earlier this year, the U.S. Surgeon General issued in a warning talking about the impact that social media is having on children. And later, so just a couple months ago, 41 American states launched a lawsuit against Meta, the parent company of Instagram and Facebook, because of the impact that those social media platforms are having on kids' mental health. And so when we see that, I think particularly in schools, we have a moral responsibility to try to curb some of that use. So right now, data from Ontario indicates that the average teen is spending over 3 hours per day on social media apps, and about a third of teens are spending over 5 hours per day. So that's quite a bit of time, and a lot of that is occurring during the school day as well. And so I think it's reasonable to have some sort of restrictions on that during the school day when kids are supposed to be focused on learning.
That was Sachin Maharaj, an assistant professor of educational leadership, policy, and program evaluation at the University of Ottawa. He joined host Angela Kokott on QR Calgary.
This is content producer Glenn Vergonia with another installment of Did You Hear? This is where we talk about the bits of news that might be slipping past your radar. But if you're a John Lennon fan, or a Beatles fan, or even a Grammys fan, well, I got something you'll really want here. Like, did you hear that a Grammy that was awarded to John Lennon is actually up for auction right now?
Shut up and take my money.
Well, if you have at least $200,000 in fun money sitting around, then yeah, it can be yours. Dang it. The members of the Beatles were awarded the Grammy Trustee statues in 1972 for recognition of their significant contributions to the field of recording. Something John was clear that he never wanted. The starting bid is $200,000 US, but it's actually anticipated to be sold for more than about $500,000. I'm Glenn Vergonia, and you're listening to Let's Talk with Dani Stover.
Coming up, this Super Piggy went to market. This Super Piggy stayed home. This Super Piggy had roast beef, which is weird. And this Super Piggy had none. And this Super Piggy went wee, 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 and took over the prairies and parts of Alberta and BC, as well as part of the U.S. And you'll hear from a guy who has been squealing on about this being a major issue for over a decade. And he wants these hogs gone like yesterday. You'll find out what's so bad about super pigs and why it's only getting worse. Unless, of course, you love invasive pigs. Then perhaps it's getting better. I'm Dani Stover. That's next on Let's Talk. Some escaped. Some folks cut fences. And these domestic pigs would then mate with wild boars, and this created invasive super pigs. And Dr. Ryan Brook has been trying to tell y'all for years that this was going to be a big problem. And he wants them gone like yesterday. But what's so bad about these pigs? Well, for one thing, they breed a lot, and they eat a lot too, almost anything, really. And they trample farm and grasslands, leaving devastation in their wake. They can also carry diseases and parasites that can impact humans and other wildlife. They kind of remind me of some people I know. Dr. Ryan Brook is a professor at the University of Saskatchewan's College of Agriculture and Bioresources. And he joined Rob Breckenridge on QR Calgary to talk about these damn invasive pigs and why no one really figured that it could get this bad.
Some experts said, there's no way they'll survive an Alberta winter, right? We get some cold spells, especially in the far north. This will kill them off. Except we know these things come from Siberia, right? And and they have very thick fur, and they're large, and they've got longer legs than a domestic pig, so they can walk through snow well. And being big is really important to surviving in the cold. And one of the things that was done on most, if not all farms, was that to get a bigger animal and a longer animal, because a domestic pig has an extra set of ribs, and so they're longer, to get a bigger pig, they were crossed with a domestic pig. And this supercharged them because they got bigger, and in the wild they could survive in the cold better, but also it really ramped up their reproductive rate. So now these wild pigs, we know from our research, these animals are having 6 young per litter on average, and they continuously reproduce. So there's no seasons like with our native wildlife. They just put out litter after litter, and gestation is only 3 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days. And so after that period, they give birth, and they get pregnant very quickly again, and just keep going. And so that reproductive rate is one of the things that has made them such a challenge to get under control.
Was there a window where we could have dealt with this, and is that long closed?
Yeah, absolutely. And I said that for many years in the early work. Like I started working on this, most of my time in 2010, and have been working basically full-time plus on it ever since. And, for the first 3 or 4 years, people asked that question a lot. And I said confidently that I think we could absolutely eradicate them completely from Canada and stay wild pig free if we do a few things really, really well. And that includes being very aggressive and having a very effective monitoring system to find and remove them. Unfortunately, literally everybody ignored all of those warnings and advice and just kept hitting the snooze button, hoping that it would magically go away. I call it management by wishing. And management by wishing, as it turns out, doesn't do a whole lot. And these pigs exploded out of control. We found occurrences across Canada over an area of more than 1 million square kilometers. And so please don't pander me by pretending that there's any chance of eradicating. If somebody's telling you right now that we can eradicate wild pigs from Canada, I'm here to tell you as the leading expert in the country on wild pigs that we have missed that window dramatically. And there are lots of opportunities to remove them in small areas, and there's lots of good things that can and should be done. But we have long missed the window of eradicating pigs from Canada, and that is anybody suggesting otherwise, that's simply nonsense in 2023 when, you can't talk about reductions or declines when the population is literally, as we speak, exploding out of control and spreading rapidly even further across the landscape.
Right. And there still seems to be a notion that, we can kill them. It's easy enough to kill an individual wild pig. Last year, the Alberta government basically place a price on the head, $75 per set of ears turned in to try to incentivize hunters to go after these pigs. But what's the other side? What's the unintended consequences of that?
Well, unfortunately, bounties and open season hunting just doesn't work because hunter success is exceedingly low. Even in relatively high density areas, we know from our research that about 3% success rate. So if there's 100 pigs and hunters go out, you can expect them to remove about 3 of those on average over the course of a year. And so that's going to have no overall impact on reducing the population because they're breeding and putting out so many babies so fast that you could removing half of the population every year and still seeing it increase and spread. And so the gap between what needs to be done of, at least 80% of that population every year, and hunters only doing about 3% and lower in lower density areas, there's just no impact on the population. But even worse is that sport hunting and these bounties break up groups and spread them around because, again, they'll see a group of 12 hunters and almost never get an entire sounder group removed. And so of those 12, they might kill 3 or 4, and that's wonderful, and that's perfectly legal. But the issue is that what happens to those animals that survive? They take off in every direction, they spread across the landscape and create new areas, and they become nocturnal, so they can't hunt at night at all, and they become very, very good at hiding, and they disappear into heavy riparian cover, and then any government control programs are going to be at least 10 times harder to have any success when the pigs are getting blasted at and spread around the landscape.
Right. And I mean, we know about the damage they can do, the environmental damage they can do. And so this has been a rural problem. But what's the risk right now that those issues become urban issues or mountain parks issues?
Well, these are some of the new things that are going to continue to pop up probably in 2024 or not too soon after that is we know what pigs do. We know what they do anywhere on the planet is they spread, and they, in the U.S., for example, I've been to cities where they've moved right into cities, and same in Europe and Asia. So moving into cities like Edmonton, we could definitely start to see sightings in the city. That has already occurred before in and around the city, and we're seeing numerous ones pretty darn close.
Now, this isn't just a Western Canada or prairie problem. My hometown, Pickering, just outside of Toronto, was hit with invasive pigs. There were 14 of them, but they don't go here anymore. These Eurasian wild boars were captured and humanely euthanized, according to the Ministry of Northern Development, Mines, Natural Resources, and Forestry. That was Dr. Ryan Brook, professor at the University of Saskatchewan's College of Agriculture and Bioresources. He joined host Rob Breckenridge on QR Calgary. Coming up, those finger traps where the more you try to pull your fingers out, the more stuck they get? In a way, that's kind of like hypnosis, meaning the more you are resistant to it, the less it will work for you, which is true for a lot of things. So maybe it's less about hypnosis working or not working and more about you and your frame of mind. I suggest you stick around to find out more about how hypnosis works and why it works for some and not others. I'm Dani Stover, and you're getting sleepy. You're listening to Let's Talk. Hey, you're listening to Let's Talk. My name's Dani Stover. Have you ever been hypnotized? Or are you skeptical of the whole thing? Because it really does come down to your frame of mind and the power of suggestion. Now, suggestion is a psychological process. It's everywhere, all the time. When you open your phone, when you throw on the hockey game, when you talk to your family, when you tell your smart speaker to play 640 Toronto or 980 CKNW, for example. And this is not to say suggestion is good or bad. You may ask for suggestions when purchasing a product or booking a service or even picking up a book. But it can also be way more pervasive than that, subtle, and dare I say, manipulative. Now, the power of suggestion does have the ability to shape your perceptions, influence your behavior without you even really being aware of it. And it can also modify your expectations. The placebo effect is a classic example of the power of suggestion. Placebo is from the Latin, I will please, and could be as simple as this pill will get rid of your headache. Will it? Well, it is just a sugar pill. But did it get rid of your headache? Hey, yeah, it did. Then it worked. I've never really thought about it this way before, but suggestion and hypnosis, while not sisters, they're first cousins for sure. Dr. Devin Terhune is a reader in experimental psychology at King's College London. He joined host Jill Bennett on 980 CKNW in Vancouver to discuss the history, the psychology, and the mechanisms of hypnosis. In 3, 2, 1.
The classic view is to view hypnosis just kind of as some type of altered state of consciousness. So you induce hypnosis through hypnotic induction, you put them in this altered state of consciousness, and one of the features of this altered state is that people are more responsive to verbal suggestions. That type of approach is often kind of frowned upon because there's not actually a lot of very strong neurophysiological and neuroimaging data to demonstrate that hypnosis is some type of distinct altered state of consciousness. So I think a superior way to think about these things is to view just hypnosis as a set of procedures. So just like we might view meditation and mindfulness-based practices as a set of procedures, we use hypnosis as a set of procedures involving some type of hypnotic induction, and the induction is there to basically to enhance or increase an individual's capacity to respond to verbal suggestions. And then afterwards, we give somebody a set of verbal suggestions. And so I think that's kind of a simpler, more straightforward way of thinking about hypnosis in a way that's less theory-laden and making a lot of assumptions. As you can see, one of the core features then of hypnosis are verbal suggestions. So suggestions are just typically communications for a change in your experience or behavior that is typically experienced in a kind of an involuntary way. So a classic verbal suggestion might be something like, this procedure is going to reduce your pain. So it's phrased as something that is happening to you as opposed to something you're willfully producing. And as you can see, hopefully, by the way I phrased that, this procedure will reduce your pain. Verbal suggestions are also a common ingredient in phenomena like the placebo effect, right? So verbal suggestions are an important ingredient, placebo, nocebo, but also something like hypnosis. I think that's a kind of as a starting point, that's a good way to think about hypnosis as a technique for harnessing verbal suggestions.
And I know it goes back. It has a lengthy history. And when did it actually start?
So it kind of depends on what historical kind of antecedent phenomena, events, and interventions you want to think about. Typically, it's kind of it's backdated to a phenomenon called animal magnetism, sometimes called mesmerism. And that was kind of where we first start to see evidence that verbal suggestions can have pronounced effects on subjective experience. The term hypnosis really emerges in the 19th century in the UK and in France. And you know, what they called hypnosis at that point and the assumptions they were making certainly differ from those of today. But again, kind of that link with an altered state of consciousness and a close link with verbal suggestion and the capacity to respond to verbal suggestions. But we see that as far back as a kind of mid 19th century.
You mentioned pain or verbal command to somebody or telling somebody that you're no longer feeling pain. Is that something that it's used for as far as medical applications and helping people with various conditions?
Yes. I mean, so one thing that's really important to emphasize about hypnosis is that it's not a panacea, so it doesn't work with everyone, it doesn't work with every symptom, and it doesn't work with every condition. Unfortunately, one of the problems with hypnosis is that a lot of people have made exaggerated claims about its efficacy in various types of contexts, and it presented as a panacea. So some phenomena, it's not particularly that great with certain symptom domains, but pain in particular, it seems to have a good degree of efficacy. We've known about that since the 19th century. So James Braid, who coined the term hypnotism, he was using hypnosis in the context of surgeries. It continues to be used as an adjunct in surgical contexts. And it's known that if you use hypnosis alongside kind of more traditional analgesic drugs for pain reduction, you can actually get patients to use the drugs less during the course of the surgery. So they rely less on the drugs because you're also including hypnosis and the verbal suggestions. So that's been fairly consistently demonstrated that hypnosis can be valuable in reducing pain, also in chronic pain conditions, but also in laboratory context, people without chronic pain conditions as well.
I know there's also it's been used, and I've known people who have used it who are trying to quit doing things like smoking and that kind of a habit if you're trying to kick that habit. You mentioned it's not for everybody. Is it that you have to be open to it and you have to believe that you can be hypnotized for it to work?
Yes, so it's not for everyone, and that's a really important starting point. And just briefly about smoking, it can be efficacious for smoking, but it's important to emphasize that that's a good example of a case where it's not actually especially valuable compared with other interventions. So it tends to have fairly similar success rates for smoking cessation as other types of treatments, whereas it seems to be better in the domain of pain, for example. But yes, you're right. You have to have an open mind. You have to be willing to kind of participate in the procedure, just like anything else, right? So if you're trying to do psychotherapy with some patient and they don't want to do psychotherapy, then it's not really going to work, right? So it's kind of just a bit of a commonsensical thing. Just like also, if you don't really think your doctor really cares about you, and they don't really have your best the best intentions, or you're kind of, they're not very caring and respectful towards you, you're not really going to kind of benefit from having sessions with your doctor, right, and appointments and so on. So it's kind of something similar to that. So you need to kind of really have some degree of belief, open-mindedness, willingness to participate, and a capacity to respond to verbal suggestions does seem to fairly reliably predict treatment outcomes, right? So people that are more responsive to hypnosis, this is sometimes termed hypnotizability or hypnotic suggestibility. Those individuals who are more responsive to hypnosis tend to be more responsive to therapeutic applications of hypnosis, as you would guess. It's not a perfect predictor, though, and so if you're kind of more low in hypnotizability or low in hypnotic suggestibility, you can still benefit from hypnosis in certain contexts. And a big factor, of course, are things like just motivation, just how motivated you are for the therapeutic intervention to work. That's a kind of a fairly common predictor, both in hypnosis and in other contexts as well, of course.
That was Dr. Devin Terhune, a reader in experimental psychology at King's College London, with host Jill Bennett on 980 CKNW. In Vancouver.
This is content producer Glenn Vergonia with another installment of Did You Hear? This is where we talk about the bits of news that could slip past your radar. But if you were affected by the Life Labs cyber breach in 2019 and you're still kind of mad about that, tune into this. This might improve your mood a little bit. Like, did you hear that those affected by the Life Labs breach in 2019 could be entitled to some money coming their way? Money. For a quick refresher for anybody who forgot what happened or is unaware, in December of 2019, Life Labs was the center of a massive cybersecurity breach that exposed sensitive and personal information of over 15 million customers throughout Canada.
No, that can't be right.
And for those who are unaware of what Life Labs is, it's a Canadian for-profit healthcare company that provides testing services for Canadian doctors in Ontario, British Columbia, and Saskatchewan, whether they're a family practice or in a hospital. Further investigation found that roughly 8.9 million people, mainly in Ontario and BC, had highly sensitive data exposed, including patients' names, addresses, emails, logins, passwords, date of birth, health card number, and lab test results.
That is sensitive information.
Extremely sensitive. Provincial privacy commissioners in both British Columbia and Ontario investigated and found that Life Labs did in fact break provincial privacy laws by failing to put safeguards around patient data. And shortly after, a class action lawsuit was opened. And this was eventually settled in the favor of the patients. Life Labs was ordered to pay out some $9.8 million in a Canada-wide settlement. Now, for those whose data was compromised, you could be eligible from anywhere between $50 to $150.
That's not very much, is it?
No, it's not very much, but let's look at this glass half full. At the very least, Life Labs has been held accountable for its failure, is promising to fix this, and is attempting to make it right with all of its patients. So maybe not the biggest payday, but at least it's a start. I'm Glenn Bergonia, and you're listening to Let's Talk with Dani Stover.
Coming up, did you know Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, A Holly Jolly Christmas, and Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree were written by the same guy, Johnny Marks? Now, the latter was recorded by Brenda Lee when she was only 13 years old, and it only reached the #1 spot this year. Why now? I'd tell you, but you will get a sentimental feeling when you hear, so don't move. My name's Dani Stover. That's next on Let's Talk. You're listening to Let's Talk. My name's Dani Stover. When you think of the song Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree by Brenda Lee, what comes to mind? I think of Kevin McAllister trying to trick two sticky bandits into thinking he had a house full of people, when really, it's just an elaborate display of strings, toy trains, and a life-size Michael Jordan cutout.
Did they come back?
Iris.
Those guys better get out of there before someone sees them. And don't come back. Unless you're thirsty for more. It's kind of amazing to think that Brenda Lee was only 13 when she recorded that song. She sounds older than me. The year was 1958, and only this year did it hit the #1 spot on the Billboard Hot 100. It only took 65 years and sets a new record for the longest gap between a song's release and its appearance at number 1. The previous record holder was Mariah Carey's All I Want for Christmas Is You. That came out in 1994, and it only took 25 years to nab the top spot. Chris Malanphy is a chart analyst and pop critic. He also hosts the Hit Parade podcast, and he joined the Kelly Contreras show to talk about some of the reasons why the time is now for Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree to achieve this status. Maybe the video helped?
The video definitely helped. I mean, it's funny to consider that in this music video, the 78-year-old Brenda Lee is lip-syncing vocals that she recorded in 1958 when she was just 13 years old, which is just crazy to consider. But, you know, you don't mess with a classic recording. And the thing about the original recording of Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree is that it was produced by the great Owen Bradley, a Nashville legend. It's kind of a perfect record in its original incarnation. And that original record is what people have been streaming year after year. So for the music video, you have, you know, the senior Ms. Lee lip syncing her 13-year-old self, and it's very charming. That definitely helped, but frankly, the data between All I Want for Christmas Is You, the perennial favorite from Mariah Carey, and Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree by Brenda Lee was getting closer and closer each year. So really, you know, as of the end of last season, you know, the Christmas song Hit Parade sort of dominates the Hot 100 every year from about early December to the first week of January. And in the final week of last year's season, so first week of January of 2023, Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree actually had slightly more streams already than Mariah Carey's song. So I think that everybody involved with Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree realized, hey, Brenda's still alive. You know, this is really attainable. It might be possible to actually get Brenda to number 1. Why don't we give this a push? Never mind the fact that it's also the 65th anniversary of this 1958 recording. And I think all those factors combine to make it number 1.
I want to just go back, if we could, for a second and just let people know who we're talking to. We're talking with Chris Malanphy, who's a chart analyst and pop critic, host of the Hit Parade podcast. Chris, you mentioned that Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree, recorded in 1958, is pretty near a perfect recording. What do you mean by that?
It's a product of its time, but in a way, it's still perfect in the 21st century because let's face it, and I remember talking about this with you last year, Kelly, Christmas music is nostalgia music. The reason that we keep coming back to some of the same recordings year after year, you know, Mariah Carey's record is now almost 30 years old. So even that has some nostalgia attached to it if you remember the 90s. But, you know, most of the records that make the Hit Parade each year are things like Andy Williams' It's the Most Wonderful Time of the Year, or Burl Ives' Have a Holly Jolly Christmas, or, you know, to pick something later in the 20th century, Wham's Last Christmas. All of these Christmas favorites are nostalgic songs. And there's something about Rockin' Around the Christmas Tree in particular. It's this perfect melding of rockabilly and, you know, teen idol music of the late 50s. You know, Brenda Lee was herself a teen idol, not unlike the likes of Elvis Presley or, you know, to pick a lower tier, a Fabian or, you know, Ricky Nelson. She was kind of that ilk back then. So it's got youthful energy. And yet the recording is just kind of, you know, perfect as it is. It sounds classic to begin with. And that's, you know, I think what people are keying into when they put it in their Spotify playlists for Christmas year after year.
Yeah, one of the things that I loved about this new video that they put out, they shot a video early this year and then released it in November with Trisha Yearwood and I don't know why I always forget this, Tanya Tucker, the country stars, is that it is so humble and average. And what I mean by that is, you know, you have Lee and she's in her kind of glitzy outfit with, you know, her bouffant hair, but they're in an average American kind of, you know, middle class, really nostalgic, like paneled living room dancing around a Christmas tree with family members. And it's really humble and homey and adorable.
I think to some extent what they're evoking there, the fact that the two co-stars of the video are not just, you know, famous people, but actual country music stars, is this is meant to be to use that overused phrase, a kind of a heartland Christmas. It's not meant to be a fancy Christmas or a glitzy Christmas. You know, not to pit them against each other, because I think Mariah Carey is in her way very happy for Brenda Lee. But Mariah Carey's record, what's kind of clever about All I Want for Christmas Is You is, you know, Mariah is famously a diva, and she's claiming that all she wants for Christmas is you. But of course, she's a very glamorous woman at the same time.
You better be dressed right.
Exactly. Whereas what Brenda Lee's song, again, recorded when she's just a teenager, it's very, you know, down home. It's kind of simple in its way, even though it's beautifully and spotlessly produced. And it's a country record as much as it's a rock and roll record. It's got that in its bones. You know, this is the moment in the 1950s when this song is recorded where R&B and country music are fusing to form rock and roll and rockabilly. And you know, Brenda, after she stopped having big hits on the Billboard Hot 100, the pop chart in the 1960s, she very seamlessly pivoted into country music and had numerous hits on the country charts through the 70s and early 80s. So Brenda really has both rock and roll and country in her bones. And I think the simplicity of the video is part of what they're evoking there.
Yeah, the Brenda Lee rocking around the Christmas tree video is cute and all, but I think it would have been better with a life-sized Michael Jordan cutout. That was Chris Malampy, chart analyst, pop critic, and host of the Hit Parade podcast on The Kelly Contreras Show.
This is content producer Glenn Vergonia with another installment of
Don't Do What Donnie Don't Does.
This is where we use a hypothetical scenario to help expose and break down real crimes and scams that are being committed all around this country, but we're especially making it clear to never try these actions at all. Seriously, just don't do it. Now, these days, we know that a lot of scams are sadly being directed towards senior citizens. And some scammers have caught on that if they pretend to be with the authorities, specifically the police, it can very easily confuse these people and take advantage of them even easier, especially if they think they're helping out family and loved ones. And who are these scammers we're talking about? Well, people like our very own Donnie Don't. Donnie was sitting around doing a whole lot of nothing and trying to come up with creative ways to earn a few $1,000s without working at all, as he normally does. And after getting the phone number of an elderly woman that he knew had a grandson, well, he came up with a sleazy idea that he knew would work with little resistance. Donnie called the woman, who we will call Ruth for this scenario, and pretended to be a police officer from a local precinct. He told Ruth that her grandson was arrested and that she would need to pay over $7,000 for his bail. And after sufficiently scaring the woman, Donnie said that a bondsman would stop by her place in a few hours to pick up the money to make it more convenient for her. Then, he would go to her house dressed as the bondsman, which really isn't much of a disguise, take her money, promised her grandson would be bailed out, got in his car, and then drove off to swim in his money, leaving Ruth confused and scared about the future of her loving grandson, who, just to be clear, was never arrested and was always completely safe. Back to reality. All jokes and scenarios aside, this very thing actually happened recently in Toronto and led to the arrest of 27-year-old Diego Armand. In this real-life scenario, police allege that Diego impersonated an officer and told the elderly woman that her grandson was arrested and she would immediately need to pay $7,500 to bail him out. Then, allegedly, Diego would go by the house under the guise of a bondsman and take her money. However, this is where it falls apart because the next day Diego allegedly tried to get an additional $7,500 from the exact same woman, pretending that the bail on her grandson had increased. At which point, the victim got concerned and called the real police, who arrived at the house and arrested and charged Armand with 2 counts of impersonating a peace officer, 2 counts of fraud over $5,000, assault with the intent to resist arrest, and failure to comply with a release order. Police believe that there are more victims and are urging anyone else who has recently fell to a similar scam to come forward. Now, we are not condoning or making light of a very serious situation. We are instead reminding you that these are very serious crimes that can carry very serious penalties. And we're especially making it abundantly clear, do not do what Donnie Don't does.
They could have made this clearer.
I'm Glenn Vergonia, and you're listening to Let's Talk with Dani Stover.
Well, you've reached the end of the show. Big thanks to Glenn Vergonia, David Spargala, and James Petrovich. I want to thank you as well for spending some time with me. If I could have one wish, it would be for world peace. If I could have 2 wishes, it would be for you to join me again tomorrow. Same time, same place. My name's Dani Stover, and this has been Let's Talk. Bye.